Hello, and welcome to Workplace Stories, the podcast where human capital experts share their real-world experiences and insights. Hosted by Red Thread Research, Workplace Stories surfaces the latest industry trends, innovative talent strategies, and best practices for success. Tune in for practical advice on how to best transform your workplace.
Welcome to Workplace Stories. Today, we have the opportunity to speak with Heather Bussing, who is a California employment lawyer, with a wealth of experience in teaching and practicing law. And we talked to her all about the executive orders with regard to DE&I and the impact or lack thereof on organizations. So Danny, what did you take away from that conversation?
Yeah, I actually learned a lot. I know a lot of people are spinning a little bit with respect to this and what it means for themselves and their organizations. She said three things that really hit home. The first one was executive orders can't make law, and they only apply to the federal government. So there's a lot of noise out there about how these are going to affect things. Obviously, we've seen some organizations pull back in the wake of this. There's probably some peer pressure. But in the end, the law is the law, and the law focuses on equal opportunity. And these executive orders don't change that at all. So that was the first thing. The second thing is she kind of had this sort of calming influence. She's just like, everyone just calm down, steady as she goes, make decisions that are the best for you all. And I thought that was good advice, kind of, especially in the wake of these executive orders kind of are toothless. They don't have a lot of meat, at least as far as the law goes. And then the third thing that she mentioned, we had kind of an interesting discussion, especially toward the end, about how DEI is becoming sort of a swear word, an expletive. And she said, you should just focus on fairness. Fairness covers all those things. And so if your organization and yourself are focusing on making sure that the workplace is fair and opportunities are fair for everyone, you're covered. You're covered by the law, and you're likely covered in the world of PR and perception. How about you? What did you take away from it?
Well, I really like all those points. A few others that stood out to me were, she mentioned that this is an opportunity to redefine or rethink what type of person or potential candidate that you are wanting to bring to your organization, and that examination is a good thing to do. So I think that was the first point. The second was one that we kind of came to together, which was she drove home the point so many times. And what occurred to me was, if we believe, as she very firmly does, that we are being fair, that we cannot discriminate, that was a law already, then maybe some of this is coming out of a lack of trust between employees and the organization when it comes to things like, how do our hiring processes work? How do our performance assessment processes work? Or our promotion processes? And so that this is really an opportunity to re-examine those processes and communicate them transparently in a way that can build trust.
I just want to dip in here because your research, the research that you did on, I think, managers last year, kind of indicated this as well. Fairness is not something, I think it was at 50% or below 50%, people that feel like their organizations are handling things fairly.
Yeah, with regard to performance assessment. Yeah, absolutely. So fairness is a question that is on the mind of at least half of your employees. So let's be clear about how we're being fair. And the third point was around, it's okay to be a little less public. And there was a big swing after the murder of George Floyd to being very public about DEI efforts. And that was actually an aberration from previous periods. And so maybe we don't necessarily need to be that public. Need to do the work, need to be fair to people in the organization, make people feel like they belong and they're included and all that stuff. But we don't have to be out there front and center with this for everyone. So we are really grateful that Heather joined us. I do feel like a calming sense after that conversation, and we hope that you all do as well. And as always, if you have any questions or comments, go ahead and reach out to us in all the places on the Red Thread platform or in other places. And if you want to have more conversations like this, go ahead and join Red Thread Research as a member, and we will continue to have these types of discussions. Welcome to Workplace Stories. Today, we have the honor of having Heather Bussing, who is a California employment lawyer, talking with us about the executive orders that were released. Now it's a couple of weeks ago, but it takes a little bit of time to respond to some of these things. So the ones that we are specifically talking about today are actually two, called Ending Radical and Wasteful Government DEI Programs and Preferencing, and Ending Illegal Discrimination and Restoring Merit-Based Opportunity. This conversation today has come about because we were hearing an immense amount of concern, confusion about this. I wrote something on LinkedIn. Whenever I write anything connected to the law, I ask Heather for her input because I am not a lawyer, though I am the daughter of two of them. And Heather was kind enough to respond, and we decided that we should do this session to talk a bit more about this. So with all that preamble, Heather, welcome to Workplace Stories.
Hi, I'm happy to be here.
So just to get us kicked off, can you start by telling us a little bit about yourself and why our audience should listen to you?
I'm a California employment lawyer. I do practice employment law, but I also do a lot of writing and analysis. I taught law school for 20 years, and I'm not doing that now, but I'm doing a daily newsletter that talks about different areas of employment law where I try to explain it or give context. And so that fills my teaching bucket, and that's what I love to do. And so I'm here to do some more.
Well, we are glad that you're here. So let's dive in right at the beginning here and talk about what an executive order is, because I think many of us have heard the term over various administrations, but may not be clear on what it is and what it can do and who it applies to and who it doesn't apply to.
So executive orders are an order by the executive, which is the president. They have been used by all the presidents going all the way back to George Washington. They are not mentioned in the Constitution, but it is a logical tool for someone to do what he's supposed to do, or she, and that is to execute the laws. So the president's job are required by Article 2 of the Constitution to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. And in this context, execute does not mean kill. It means carry out. And so it's referring to laws that already exist. Congress's job is to make the laws. The president's job is to carry out the laws. So the president cannot make new law with executive orders or anything else. That said, it doesn't stop them from trying. And certainly presidents of all parties have pushed that limit. So here we are. But if you look at the language of the orders themselves, they talk about stopping illegal DEI or illegal affirmative action. And that's a way to act like you're carrying out existing law. But if you're saying that something is already illegal, that means there is a law on it. So check. But why are you doing executive order if it's already illegal? So it's redundant and it doesn't really make sense in the context. And when you take it in a broader context of what the administration and the cabinet members and assorted other people are saying, they are trying to make new law. They are trying to roll back discrimination law, but they haven't because they can't.
Right.
Well, let's maybe put that. So I love the sort of broad, what is an executive order and what are people trying to do with it? Let's talk a little bit about the ones in front of us right now. What do these executive orders say, the ones of the last couple of weeks, especially with regard to DEI? A, for those of you who don't know, I was just educated on this as well. A is accessibility. So diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility.
Well, the DEI order focuses on federal contractors primarily. And that's okay because the federal government gets to decide what the federal government does. What they are trying to do is eliminate affirmative action in federal contracting. And there is affirmative action in federal contracting that allows people in that process to take into account that a business is woman-owned or that a business is minority-owned. They don't get a boost. They don't get extra points towards being awarded the contract, but the data is tracked. to make sure that the federal government is handing out contracts fairly and not discriminating. And so the law is the federal government cannot discriminate in the way it allocates and awards federal contracts. That's still the law. And the idea of affirmative action here is not illegal, and it is perfectly consistent with the law. So it's gobsmacking and mind-boggling to try to make sense of some of this stuff. And then the other thing that's in the DEI order is a direction to private employers to stop doing illegal DEI, quote, illegal DEI. And there is no such thing as illegal DEI unless it rolls into what many people confuse with affirmative action. And affirmative action, in some cases, allows a decider to take into account a protected factor. And the idea behind that was we need to level the playing field. We have a long history of discrimination in our country, and we want to make sure that we are actually giving people equal opportunity. But the Supreme Court has said that those types of programs are not fair because they do give somebody extra credit for being in a particular race or gender or disability or whatever. And so that was decided, I think, a year-ish ago in the Students for Admission to Harvard case. So affirmative action, to the extent that it gives somebody an advantage, is already illegal, has been illegal for a while, and nobody is supposed to be doing it, and I don't know why they're abolishing it now. DEI is not affirmative action, legal or illegal. DEI is why we have text messaging, because text messaging was developed so that deaf people could communicate easily and effectively. It's why we have ramps that we can roll our strollers down on the curbs. DEI is about including everybody and trying to remove obstacles for them. It's not giving anybody a special advantage. It benefits everyone. It also benefits white men because you cannot discriminate against someone because they are a white man. That would be race and gender discrimination. It's really sort of confusing, but it's also really confusing about how they're trying to describe and what they're trying to do. And it doesn't really make sense when you understand what the law is.
So let's talk about, we're going to set aside our federal government employees and leaders for the sake of the conversation, because a lot of what we have been hearing has been about the implications on the private sector. So let's talk a little bit about how these EOs apply to these private sector organizations, or even if they do.
They don't.
At all, right? Like hands down, that's it.
At all. Because the president cannot make law. And so when the federal government wants an employer to do something or not do something, they have to pass a law. And Congress is the one that passes that law. Then there's questions of who has jurisdiction and what law applies, because in employment law, all 50 states get to make their employment laws, and the federal government also makes some overarching laws. The states are free to make whatever laws they want to be as long as it's consistent with federal law, and it has to provide equal or greater protection for employees. So even if they were to try to roll back and repeal Title VII, state law would still be in effect. And most states have laws that protect all employees in employment decisions and provide often more protected classes than the federal. So we are not going to see discrimination law disappear anytime soon, even if the federal government decides that it wants to do that. But I also don't know how they could do that, because if their goal is to give one race or gender a boost, they would end up doing exactly what they have said that they're trying to abolish. Because the reality is that these laws do protect everybody.
So yes, from a lawyerly standpoint, which is why you're here, that is absolutely true. But I'm really interested in sort of the cultural repercussions of something like this. You know what I mean? The way that they were phrased, said, hey, we've been doing this illegally for years, even though, as you have clearly laid out, that is not the case. They were, in my opinion, fairly inflammatory, the way that they were sort of, you know what I mean? There was emotion involved with how they were titled and stuff like that. And so I'm curious, we're already seeing chilling effect on DEI programs in the private sector due to these executive orders. And even before these executive orders, as soon as the election results were sort of solidified, we saw some of this start to happen. What do you think is going to happen with respect to, why are we seeing it? Is it just peer pressure? Is it because it's cheaper? Like, why do you think we're seeing less focus on some of these things?
Well, and you guys, I'd be interested in your opinion, but my theory is that after George Floyd, everybody started DEI programs, but not everybody put budget and resources and commitment behind them to actually increase the diversity of the workforce. And you can't do that by saying, I need you to hire 10 Black women. You just say, I would like you to work harder to find qualified candidates so that I can interview a diverse panel of applicants. That does not say hire a Black woman. That says do your best to find qualified candidates. So many of the DEI programs that were put in place didn't do anything.
Right. They were toothless. Yeah.
And it's not surprising they didn't do anything. And so this is a chance for those organizations to say, hey, we didn't get the return that we were hoping for. And so we're just not going to do this anymore. But that doesn't mean they're not going to continue to hire qualified applicants of all races, genders, shapes, and colors.
So I think, just to augment that, there's also a response to the cultural shift, broader cultural shift. So I'm a historian by education. And whenever we see changes in social movements, we tend to see a swing one way and then a swing and a pull back the other way. But often it doesn't go back as far as it was. And so I think that, to your point, Heather, there was this post-murder of George Floyd real push. And then some people who felt like maybe that had gone too far. And now we're seeing the others, another perspective pulling it back. So this is, I don't think, out of context historically, if we just think about whether it's, women's right to vote or any other such thing. But I think then when you layer on top of this, there has been also a series, or in particular, a couple of investor activists who have made it their mission to target these companies and to bring lawsuits against them, or at least to put measures for their boards of directors to consider, indicating kind of a shot across the bow, these organizations' investment in DEI. So the top person is a gentleman named Robbie Starbuck, and he has been very publicly going after companies and claims responsibility for companies like Tractor Supply and Ford pulling back publicly. So there's been kind of those two other things happening at the same time as this.
Yeah, and they're connected.
Yes, they're definitely connected. And I think the thing that's interesting here, at least from my perspective, and I'd love your thoughts on this, Heather, is after the Supreme Court ruling, or even in the run-up to it, there were some people who were thinking, hey, that has to do with higher education. That's not going to have an impact. And yet we still saw an impact, right? Like this pullback has been happening for at least since then, if not before that. But the argument that people were having was, well, we don't discriminate in hiring. Like it is illegal. And so why would we make these changes? And so I think it really gets so much into what this cultural shift, because in theory, to your point, legally, we haven't been doing anything. Companies have not been doing anything wrong, or if they have, people have had a way to try to get that addressed.
Well, exactly. But there's also a big shift in the approach to discrimination within companies, because so when I first started practicing law before the internet, the approach was Do not know anything you don't have to know about an applicant as long as possible, because if you don't know, you can't be accused of discriminating against the person because of that. But now we have LinkedIn and we have the internet, and we know all sorts of things about people before we ever meet them, because their pictures are online and they talk about whether they have kids and da-da-da-da-da. And so the field has changed. And then we have technology, and we are making data everywhere. And we have people analytics that are full of demographics. And the legal standard is employers are held to what they know and what they reasonably should know. So if you have a people analytics program that tracks demographics, if you know where there are issues, and you can't ignore them. So it's not just data, it's evidence. And so cases are easier to prove now because there is evidence that the employer holds. And we're not going to stop that because the information is too valuable. It's really useful for figuring out workforce planning and efficiencies and budget. And, this data is magical in many aspects, but it also means that you can't afford to ignore problems. And so I think we're seeing employers become a little more responsive, and that combined with public perception that we really need to work towards better equality. This is the pushback, but it's a different world now. It's a different world now because employers do understand their workforce and they do understand what's going on. And you don't just have to wait for someone to make a claim. And the law is changing too. So pay equity, pay transparency. These are all laws that are designed to actually help solve problems rather than just create a remedy for somebody who violates it. It's a whole different world, and I'm not sure that anybody is taking all of this into account as we move through these philosophical differences.
So do you consider this just to all be a lot of noise? If it doesn't change the law, and most organizations are like, well, we still can't discriminate, so why would we even consider it? And we have the data that in many cases points to, well, if we have a diverse workforce, then it actually helps our innovation. Are we just making a lot of noise?
We're not, but the federal government is.
It's not us, but is it a noise, like a distraction, rather than something we need to really worry about?
It's propaganda.
Propaganda.
It is a clear signal about where they would like to go, and they're testing the limits to see how far they can get.
Okay. So let's talk about like where they would like to go and how far they can get. So no legal repercussions. What about reputational risks for private employers? Like if they continue, we've seen several, Stacia mentioned a couple that have sort of backed down on the DEI thing. We've seen others that are sort of doubling down and they're like, no, we're going to do the right thing. Are there reputational risks to either of those groups based on the climate?
Sure. Who do you want to hire? What do you need for your business? Who is your client base? Can you afford to offend them and alienate them? Target is probably asking these questions right now because they rolled back some DEI stuff and they had been very visual out there in supporting everyone. And they're regrouping, I think. But the backlash has been that people are not shopping at Target just because of that. And that's real. That matters.
Yeah. Or the Anheuser-Busch example is probably the biggest one from last year as well.
But we also have the Meta version where some things were rolled back. A lot of people dipped out of Meta for a week and then came back. Like, how long is it before people need diapers and they're back at Target? You know what I mean? Are we thinking short term or is it a long term stand by your values sort of thing? I don't have a good sense of that.
Yeah, I think everyone has sort of their own thresholds. People feel like they would like to be doing something right now. And so they're doing what they can. And that's an okay thing.
I think a lot of this, I think we're going to see three sets of behavior here. One is those who react, as we've seen many of these who have pulled back. One is those who stand firm, if you will. So Delta came out just a couple days ago, Costco, Apple, very firm in their affirmation. And then I think we're going to see a whole bunch of them who sort of shrinking violet, pull some of the language, soften some of the language, but are still doing the same thing inside. And the reason I think that is because that is what we've seen for the last 18 months. The majority of the companies I've been talking to have been pulling back their external language, their external publications of their DEI numbers, et cetera, et cetera. But when you ask them, what are you doing? Or has the commitment level changed? Like, no, we know this is important to our business. So we're going to keep doing the things that are important to our business. We're just not going to put a target on our back.
Exactly. And their lawyers are telling them to do that because it's expensive to fight with people.
And that's not what they're in business to do.
And that's not what they're in business to do.
I do wonder if we are going to see a general pulling back, though, of leaders, business leaders making commentary on social issues. Because we have seen over the last 5-7 years, much more of a, you need to take a stance on this news thing that came out, that kind of stuff. And I think that this is probably the biggest indicator of that harming companies. And I think that we may see these leaders kind of pull back into this. It'll be interesting. It's February when we're recording this. The Edelman Trust Barometer for years has said that to increase trust in the organization, people wanted their leaders to take a social position. I wonder if this year we're going to see a dramatic change.
And on that note, we're going to lighten things up just a little bit. We're going to do a couple of lightning round questions, Heather, and this is just to get our audience to know you just a little bit better. So 3 lighthearted, fun questions before we dive back into what HR professionals should be thinking about with respect to this stuff. Does that sound all right?
Okay, let's go.
All right, I've got the first one. Heather, would you rather sail or van life around the world?
Sail. Oh my God, easy. I love the water. I love boats. No question.
All right. Okay. Where do you find inspiration?
Books. I read. My to-be-read pile has gone feral. I went into a used bookstore the other day and came out with more things than I could carry.
This is why I go to the library, because at some point they make me give them back.
Right. Yes.
All right, Heather. A genie grants you one wish. What do you wish for?
That all humanity be relieved of suffering.
World peace. Good one.
Even better. But I'm serious. It is not easy being human in this world, and we all struggle.
All right, Danny, back into it.
All right, let's get back into it. So I'm curious, Heather, from a legal standpoint, what would you maybe advise private sector HR and legal teams to be doing as they assess their DEI in light of the EO changes or lack of?
What I always advise them to do, what you guys always advise them to do, which is to sit down and really go back to what their business strategy is, what they're trying to solve, what they're trying to do, and what really matters. That's going to be slightly different for every company, depending on what they do and who their clients are and what matters to those clients and what matters to people that they want to hire. My brother worked in oil and gas for his whole career, and they had the worst time recruiting people because nobody wanted to work in fossil fuel. So these things matter. And so the answer is going to be different for everyone. But I am fine with the shrinking violet approach. I am fine with the do nothing, stay steady, and see what happens. But there are people who are going to see a great opportunity to differentiate themselves on this both ways. That's an okay thing to do. I mean, we talk so much about authenticity, and we're going to see some people actually showing everyone who they are, good and bad.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to mention is for our Red Thread members, we actually have a series of reports on DEIB analytics, and in particular on the partnerships that need to be in place when you are looking at DEIB and metrics and all of that stuff. And so I would just encourage you to look at that. there's a whole section on like make best friends with your legal team and how you want to approach that. And also with your business leaders in the context, because so much of this, and I think some of the reason we're seeing some of those companies come out so strongly one way is around, or I guess, and the other way is around employment value proposition, employment branding. And a lot of that gets to your point just now, Heather, around who do you attract to the organization and how do you talk about that? But having an aligned approach amongst all those different teams when it comes to this is super important.
And don't forget your PR and comms people, because they know what they're doing and they will help you.
Yeah.
Shout out to the comms people.
For sure. And so many of them have been involved in this in the past. And so I wouldn't expect this to be any different. But if you happen to be in an org where that's not the case, make sure it is.
Yes, exactly.
So let's talk about if organizations should actually do something different. So should they think about hiring or their talent funnel or promotion or talent management any differently in this new environment?
No, don't do what you're already doing, which is the right thing for your business, and keep hiring diverse, qualified candidates that will help you get done what you are trying to do. The labor shortage is not going away. It's not evenly distributed, but it is real, and it is real for the indefinite future. We need everyone.
So along with that, for the last few years, pay equity has been a big conversation. I'm wondering if you think these orders directly hit it or influence it at all.
I don't think so. And I don't think it will, because the foundational concept of equal pay for equal work is not really controversial.
Good point.
And the reality is that often it benefits white men just as much as it benefits everybody else because of wage compression. You see, when you run the analysis, you see that there are people with less tenure who are making more than the people who have been there. And, I just saw some statistics come out from ADP on the amount you can expect to get a raise if you stay in your job versus job change. And it's been for years that you change jobs if you need more money. So these are all going to be important factors for people to take into account and to make sure that their pay is not just equitable, but also competitive. And they go hand in hand.
And I want to call out for our audience that Heather's actually co-authored a book called Get Pay Right. I think I actually literally have 2 copies of it in my house.
All right.
So if this question of pay equity and the importance of it in your organization and how you create it is top of mind, recommend having a look at it.
We'll link to that in the show notes as well.
On that topic, though, we have seen some instances, right, where companies have linked executive pay to DEI objectives. To be clear, not DEI quotas, which are not allowed. Those are illegal. Things like, for instance, a higher measure of sense of inclusion in the organization, something you might be measuring in an engagement. So do you think there are risks for those organizations?
Not practically, not from an evidentiary, can you prove that this is illegal factor? It's how does this look, and does this create a risk that somebody's going to come after us? Today, the new Attorney General said that she was going to institute criminal investigations against companies for illegal DE&I. And that makes absolutely no sense whatsoever, because there are no criminal laws that relate to discrimination it's just gobsmacking. I feel like a mad woman running around going, this is not how it works. This doesn't work this way. But it really doesn't work this way, and it won't. But that won't stop people from making a big deal, because the point with a lot of this is just to make the big deal. They don't care if it works. So on some level, I can scream and yell, it's not legal, it doesn't work that way. But there's still a risk there because nobody wants to have to deal with it. And that's the power. That's the power that we're up against. And so how do you deal with that? Well, again, it goes right back to what we were talking with earlier. It's like, what matters to you? What are you trying to do? How do you navigate this the best way for you, your clients, and your employees? I will be speaking out because I am in a position where I can do that. But not everyone is. And I think it's important to acknowledge that and to not judge people based on their very public stances. We judge people based on what they do, not their public personas.
Absolutely. I want to ask maybe a final question, at least for right now. And that is what I feel like we've talked about is like, basically, so long as you were following the law before, you're fine. But some of these organizations may make changes, maybe out of the fear that you just mentioned. I mean, we didn't talk about it explicitly, but one of the EOs directs the attorneys generals to find up to 9 examples of companies. What actually is interesting is the actual language is practitioners, which concerns me deeply because that means individuals as opposed to companies. But I'm assuming, giving the benefit of the doubt, that they actually mean companies. But anyway.
Well, their companies would be obligated to indemnify them legally.
Okay, so that's good to know.
They're not out there on their own. It's companies.
But some will change. How would you suggest that they frame these changes if they decide to do so?
Don't discriminate. Whatever you do, don't discriminate. Don't discriminate against anyone. That doesn't stop people from being biased because we're human and humans are biased. And we do stuff with really good intentions that doesn't always work out or that is harmful. And so monitor your outcomes, make sure that you're on top of problems and intervene before they become claims. Fix the problem.
And I think, some of this gets at the issue of trust, which we talked about just a couple of moments ago. But when we did our research last year on performance management, we asked, to what extent do you believe your organization has a fair performance assessment process? And that number was the lowest number we've seen in the last 5 or 6 years. And so much of that, I believe, comes back to a lack of trust in the process, or maybe a lack of transparency in the process. And, that's just performance management. That isn't necessarily promotion. That's not necessarily hiring. But if you take that as a general proxy, and it was over 50% of folks who said they basically didn't trust, there's a widespread distrust. So maybe if we're trying to find a little bit of a silver lining here, it's go back to your processes, communicate how they're fair, communicate what they are if you don't do that now. But have a look at them and make sure they are fair and that employees feel like they understand them and can trust them.
Oh, exactly. And never frame things as us v. them. Because most of the time, employers and employees are on the same side with the same goals. And that's what you want. That's a well-functioning organization with happy employees. But the minute you get a claim, the minute you get then everything goes adversarial. And the problem with binary adversarial issues is that you stop right there trying to solve the problem, and it's all about being right or winning. And so it just perpetuates itself. So as you're approaching these issues, ask yourself, how can we stay on the same side? That yes, there is a power difference between employers and employees, but it doesn't have to matter if everyone's on the same page on trying to accomplish the same things. And so how do you bring people into that mindset?
Heather, thank you so much for being with us today. I know I feel better. I don't know if Stacia does, but I feel a little calmer than I did when I started this conversation. We like to end each of these podcast episodes with one question. We call it our purpose question. And that question is, why do you do the work that you do?
I am so fortunate to get paid to learn and teach. I am just the luckiest human in the world. And that's true for lawyers. And it's been true my whole career because effective legal writers are teaching things to the judge or the jury. And so that's always been true. But the really sweet thing right now for me is that I have a lot of control over what I get to learn and teach. So that's a wonderful thing, but that's why I just am so curious and I want to understand.
Well, we're glad. We're glad you have that propensity to both learn and teach, because I think we've learned something here today. Thanks for being with us, Heather.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Heather.
Okay, that's a wrap for this episode of Workplace Stories. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to our podcast so that you can be the first to know about future episodes. For exclusive access to our research, insights, and a vibrant network of human capital leaders, consider joining the Red Thread Research community. Visit redthreadresearch.com to learn more and to take your workplace to the next level.